Good evening and welcome to this evening's Colorado Law Talk. My name is Georgette Vigil. I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Engagement and Donor Relations at Colorado Law. We are so happy that you are here. During the presentation tonight, a few housekeeping items. I know we're all pros with Zoom at this point, but the Q&A function is at the bottom of your screen. There will be two opportunities to ask Professor Brad Bernthal questions, and he will respond to your questions. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize that the University of Colorado sits upon land within the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples' territories. Further, we acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. This evening's Colorado Law Talk, Who Needs Contracts? The Puzzling Behavior of Startup Mentors, featuring Professor Brad Bernthal. Colorado Law's mission includes providing exceptional legal education, engaging in critical thinking and research, and producing influential scholarship with impact in real-world challenges to the status quo. Many of our graduates go on to meaningful public service work, which directly benefits communities and society. The Colorado Law Talk series was launched in 2017 to share research, knowledge, and ideas of the Colorado Law faculty with the broader legal community in the Denver area and beyond. Brad specializes in startups, entrepreneurial law, and early stage finance, such as angel investment and venture capital. His current research studies finance instruments used in startup investment. Prior to that, Brad studied investment accelerators, providing legal scholarship for first work on the topic. Professor Bernthal is the founder and director of Silicon Flatiron Center Entrepreneurship Initiative. The Entrepreneurship Initiative launched in 2008 and creates a high velocity of interaction between CU campus and Front Range high-tech entrepreneurial community. The Entrepreneurship Initiative is closely involved with the CU New Venture Challenge, Startup Colorado, and Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network. You can find out more about Professor Brad Bernthal and his notable background in the detailed biography that was emailed to you. I am delighted to now turn the program over to Professor Bernthal.
Thank you, Georgette, great to be here for the talk, and looking at the attendee list, it's fun to see several alumni who I've worked with over the years that have joined, and looking forward to your questions. Before I get going, I want to give a special thank you to Georgette and Yesenia for their organizational work for the Colorado Law Talks. It's an honor to be included, and they've really done the hard yards in terms of organization. What I've got in mind is to do this talk in three parts. I'll do part one, ideally in about 15 minutes, and somewhere around 5:50, we'll stop. If you've got questions along the way, please drop them into the Q&A, and Georgette and Yesenia are going to give me a hand in going through the questions. And then I'll cover parts 2 and 3 of the discussion and try to stop wherever I am about 6:15. I think the last 15 minutes of Q&A will be a dynamic and hopefully engaging way to talk about some of these materials. So with that, I am going to share my screen, I think. Give me a second. Oh, I was going to. Got our first tech malfunction of the night. Give me a second. All right. Hopefully you can see the slides here, who needs contracts, and away we go. So I teach a course here on venture capital at Colorado Law It's about half law students, half MBAs, and 1/3 engineers. That's my lawyer math there. Ton of fun to teach it. And this is an interesting place to teach about startups, venture capital, and the process of building new companies, because as many of you probably know, Boulder is in the heart of one of the world's best places to start a company. This is a world-class startup community. Indeed, at Silicon Flatirons, where I'm the interim executive director right now, we do a lot of activities that brings this world-class startup scene through the law school. And for those of you who are here in the Boulder area, I invite you to join us this summer for something called the Startup Variety Show. You'll see that our first variety show is going to be May 18th here in the courtroom. If you were to sit in on the venture capital class, you'll see themes from tonight's lecture. And one of your responses might be, really? Is that law? Is this law? And my answer would be, probably. I think we do an excellent job here at Colorado Law of teaching our students business law. But we do one other thing, which is we teach our students about the broader context in which our clients are going to be active. We teach them about the importance of understanding the business model, what is going to make or break this business. And in the world of startups, my contention is you can't really understand the legal elements unless you understand the larger picture in which startups and the people around the startups are active. And tonight's discussion, Who Needs Contracts, will ideally make that clear. By way of preview, here's how we will proceed. 3 parts with maybe some bonus material as time permits. Part 1, economic geography. When it comes to startups, is the world flat? This is an homage to a book written by Thomas Friedman called The World is Flat. We're going to look at this through the lens of startups. Is the world flat? Part 2, we're going to look at a creature called the for-profit accelerator. This is an industry, the accelerator industry, that Boulder helped launch. And I'm going to look at one particular feature of it, which is the role of experts called mentors. And mentors work closely with startups in the accelerator, and they do it for free. And that's kind of a puzzle. And my puzzle is, why do mentors give away their time, expertise, and help for free? And that leads to part 3, which is my answer, which is by organizing the accelerator system the way it's conducted and attracting volunteers willing to work for free, a certain system of exchange emerges called a generalized exchange system. I'll detail why that works and why I think that best explains how accelerators work. And then finally, there's some emerging questions that follow as time permits. So that is where we're going. Part 1, economic geography. So the term economic geography explores the relationship between place, that is, a particular geographic location, and economic productivity and outputs. That's the essence of economic geography. Krugman defines economic geography as, quote, the study of location of factors of production in space. So you get the gist. That's what economic geography is all about. And when it comes to startups, there's an interesting feature, which is that startups often co-locate, that is, they concentrate themselves in specific areas. So let's take a historic example that the automobile industry, which once was full of startups in the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s, that industry concentrated, of course, around Detroit in the United States. When it comes to other types of industry sectors, say technology startups, Of course, the most famous scene is that of Silicon Valley and that part of Northern California. Other startup scenes are well known as well: Austin, Texas, Boston, Massachusetts, New York City, Seattle, and right in that list of best places to launch a new venture is where we are in Boulder, Colorado, and really the Front Range of Colorado. There's some interesting issues here, including why do startups concentrate in a given location? And moreover, why has concentration of startup activity, the fancy academic term for this is agglomeration, why do we see this as persistent in an age in which you can think about doing things through broadband connections from remote, virtually, as we're doing this discussion? That is, why so far does concentration seem to be persistent? Okay. This question, when it comes to startups, is the world flat? What I mean by that is, if you are to launch a new company, does it matter where you do it? That is there any advantage to being in a spiky place full of other entrepreneurs and other startups, Silicon Valley, Austin, Boulder, relatively speaking, compared to a location where there are not very many startups? Say, for example, I'll pick on my home state of Nebraska. You're in North Platte, Nebraska, a nice place out in central Nebraska where there are not a lot of startups involved. So when it comes to startups, does it matter in terms of your chances of success if you start your new business in a place that is already a thriving startup hub versus a place where there are not an abundance of startups? And the answer so far to this is resoundingly, the startup world is spiky, not flat. These are pictures right here from the New Venture Challenge Championships, which is the CU premier showcase of the best companies coming off of the CU Boulder campus each year. This happened last week. It was down at the Boulder Theater. It was just absolutely fabulous to be back in the room, incredible energy. And in particular, there were 9 startups that presented as part of the New Venture Challenge Championships. And I'm telling you, all 9 of these companies have a chance. An incredible group of entrepreneurs, very promising ideas. And it is not an accident that this occurred in Boulder and off the CU campus. Quality startups very seldom just seem to materialize out of thin air. A startup, a new company, a new venture tends to be a tiny little thing, often 2, 3, or 4 founders. They have very limited resources. They may not have a facility or work space to work out of. They may be working out of coffee shops or their homes. They have very little access to capital. They're often very resource constrained and either bootstrapping, that is, using their own funds, or taking very limited amounts of money from people outside the company. In order to succeed, these fragile little entities need a ton of help from outside the boundaries of the startup. They need financing. They need specialty help like legal assistance. They need access to talented employees and independent contractors, and they need advice. And mentors, experts who have been through it before, play a key role in helping companies like the ones that we saw at the New Venture Challenge get a real chance. That is, when you start a company at CU and in a world-class startup community like Boulder, you have access to all sorts of help from outside the company that if you were to do this in North Platte, Nebraska, you don't have access to those types of resources. That is, historically, and I think until today, when it comes to startup geography, it is massively unfair. Entrepreneurs in startup hubs have large advantages relative to entrepreneurs trying to start companies outside of existing startup communities. Why is this the case? Let's talk a little bit about economic geography. The classic explanation here comes from economists going back to Alfred Marshall, who did his work back in the 1920s. And the classic explanation as to why startups concentrate and why they get advantages from concentration in terms of geography is external economies of scale. There's two concepts that are relevant here. The first is the notion of external. Ask yourself, external to what? And what this plays upon is the idea of the startup, the new company itself, and factors, inputs that are needed by the startup that are going to have to come from outside the boundaries of the company. And so external refers to the internal resources of the company, which, as we talked about, are very limited, and the ton of things that are needed that have to come from outside the boundaries of the company. Think skilled labor, access to employees, functional specialists, the need for infrastructure, et cetera. The second concept here is the notion of economies of scale, which by definition refers to the fact that the greater the amount of output, the lower the cost of producing one unit. Okay, so let's make this specific to a startup scene. And because this is a law talk, we'll make it specific to the production of lawyers. When a startup conducts a financing, that is, it raises money from investors outside the startup, okay, lawyers often help make sure that securities laws are complied with and help with the corporate documents and associated contracts that need to be addressed there. Okay, consider yourself doing this for the first time. Okay, in order to understand the intricacies of a venture capital financing, it is going to be time and labor intensive. Okay, finding the documents, understanding the documents, getting yourself up to speed. If this is the first time you've done this as an attorney, it's going to be time intensive. And if you're the client, it could be very expensive. Let's just ballpark it at 100 hours the first time you do it. Next week, another client comes along and says, we want basically the same type of venture capital financing done. Well, at that point, you've already got the documents. You've already understood the key concepts, and the work maybe instead of 100 hours is now 50 hours. And as you go further on and have an area in which you are more frequently doing the same type of work, what happens as an attorney, you get better at it, your expertise is greater, and you're probably able to do that more efficiently for your clients. Okay, so as the level of output in that specialty area increases, the cost of producing one unit decreases. That's just a small example of the idea of economies of scale. And it's also an example of external economies of scale, because it's very unlikely that the early stage startup is going to be able to afford its own in-house attorney to conduct the venture financing. And so having expert attorneys nearby that are familiar and frequently do these types of deals reduces the cost associated with getting a venture capital deal done. That's an example of external economies of scale. And that's the classic explanation as to why there's advantages to startup concentration. But there's limits as to what explanatory value you can get when it comes to external economies of scale. And in a paper that I wish I wrote, a researcher at Cal Berkeley, Anno Saxenian, asked an interesting question. She looked at this. She said, if you look at Boston, what was called Route 128, circa 1975, and you look at the Silicon Valley, circa 1975, they both look a lot alike. And they both have the elements that we associate with external economies of scale. For example, they each had a major research university that brought in large amounts of defense dollars for research. MIT in Boston, Stanford in the Valley. They each had successful, thriving, large technology companies. For example, DEC in Boston, HP in the Valley. They each had startup scenes that were oriented around technology with outside providers who were familiar with working with startups. And they each had specialty talent pools of employees available to join companies. In short, if you look at Boston and Silicon Valley in 1975, they each have external economies of scale that benefit companies that are in that geography. And yet, if you look at those two areas by 1990, Silicon Valley economically has run laps around Boston. And Saxenian asked a terrific question. Why? What is the explanation that these two thriving startup communities had such disparate results in terms of the way they adapted and evolved during that 15-year period of time? And the answer is what Saxenian called a networked approach. She analyzed the different patterns of behavior in Silicon Valley versus Boston, and her analysis went like this. She said, look at the embeddedness of where companies are situated in their geographic area. That is, examine the complex of institutional and social relationships that connect producers in a fragmented industry structures. Instead of looking at the companies in isolation, what Saxenian did is she widened the aperture and looked at the social practices in those areas. For example, in Silicon Valley, there was a norm of sharing information across different companies, even among competitors. Whereas in Boston, the social norms were much more those of confidentiality and protecting proprietary information. Speak only to other people about the company who are within the company, two very different sets of social practices between Boston and Silicon Valley. Institutional structure looked very different as well. As we talk about that period of time from 1975 to 1990, Boston companies continued to be, by and large, vertically integrated. That is, they tried to do the multiple inputs required to produce, say, computers, all within the confines of one company. In contrast, Silicon Valley companies took a more horizontal approach. That is, they tried to specialize in an area and they contracted and relied upon other companies and other sources for inputs required to create their product. Okay. Third is look at the legal background. And there's a very interesting contrast during the period of time between the legal backdrop in Massachusetts versus California. And this is a great study of the law of unintended consequences. In Boston and in Massachusetts during this period of time, non-competes were enforceable. That is, Massachusetts law allowed a company to enter into agreements with an employee that would prevent that employee from going and working with a competitor across the street. In California, law 16600 prohibited the non-compete agreements between companies and their employees. That is, California law said, basically, companies, you cannot prevent your employees for going and working with a competitor because we will not, as a matter of state law, allow non-competes. Now, this allowed for an information flow and a fluidity across companies in Silicon Valley that stands in sharp contrast to those in Boston and allowed for ideas to be exchanged and innovation occur as cross-fertilization of people occurred just by virtue of the fact that there were no enforceable non-competes in Silicon Valley. So this looked like really prescient policymaking out in California until you ask, what was the origin of non-compete law in California? And the answer is, in the latter parts of the 19th century, California needed a legal code. It was an amalgamation of indigenous law, law from Mexico, and law pieced together in the Wild West. And so they looked for a legal code from one that was drafted but never adopted in New York, called the Field Code. In California, the legislature in the latter parts of the 19th century, a long time before Silicon Valley ever emerged, adopted the New York Field Code, which New York never adopted. And in there was, yes, California law 16600, which prohibited non-competes and turned out to be a major advantage in terms of the networked approach that we see in Silicon Valley. So, for example, Saxenian analyzes the different trajectories of companies like DEC versus HP. DEC operated in Boston, vertically integrated, autarkic and closed, trying to do everything in-house versus Silicon Valley companies like HP, a horizontal approach, encouraged information sharing with competitors, relied upon competitors for innovation. And what happened, Silicon Valley companies like HP were able to iterate much faster as the technology industry became one of rapid change, unstable markets, and really favored companies that were able to take advantage of horizontal structures of production. Okay. So coming back to this question of economic geography, if concentration powerfully favors startups in 21st century, in the 21st century, and by understanding external economies of scale and the networked approach, you better understand why startups in concentrated areas are relatively better off than startups outside of startup communities. If this is a powerful advantage, two questions become existential for areas today. One, how does a geography kickstart a startup community? And two, once a startup community exists, how does it best evolve and adapt? Okay, so that's backstory in terms of part one and what economic geography is broadly about. Let's stop there, Georgette, and take a few questions. Go ahead.
Okay, if anyone has any questions, please put those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We do not have any questions yet. Oh, here.
I can only assume that's perfect clarity in communication. So there are no, I'm glad, and I'm looking at Charlie Clark and Andy Marchant and Mackenzie have come through this class. They're now finally convinced that it was correct. All right.
Yes, Andy has a question. Andy Merchant, do you have any thoughts or have you seen any academic study coming out about the new remote/virtual work world? And if it is minimizing the importance of economic geography on entrepreneurial ecosystems, or more specifically, mentor relationships?
That is, Andy skipped to the end of the presentation. Let me back up a little bit and say it is remarkable when you talk to entrepreneurs right now, how dramatically the pandemic has shifted the formation of companies. And in particular, founders, you'd occasionally see a distributed team among the first 3-4 members of a company, which is usually called the founding team. But typically you'd see those individuals in the same geographic location. There's advantages to being in the same garage, in the same coffee shop, et cetera. And by the way, that's where you find trusted people who have, like-minded skill sets and that you're interested in working with. The pandemic shifted that. And I am astounded at how many companies that are being founded today have one founder in Boulder and the remaining team is elsewhere. They locate them online, sometimes in the United States, sometimes internationally. Often they have capital. That is, their financing is coming from outside Boulder as well. And these companies are essentially being launched and grown in a way that is entirely distributed. It's really interesting, Andy. And what I think that the questions to keep an eye on is not will startup communities continue to exist and be powerful, but how do they start to escape geography? That is, or how do they blend geography with virtual connectivity? And I have not seen studies yet. I know that you're a startup attorney. You're probably seen super interesting things. If other people have notes on this, please drop them into the Q&A. It would be super interesting to hear. But this is a powerful shift, and we'll talk a little bit what that mean for mentors shortly.
Wow. Second question comes to us from Grant Hillspeller. Have places with less startup-friendly laws endeavored to change laws, such as lobbying for prohibitions on non-competes, emulating California? If so, have they seen success?
So the short answer to that is yes. Many geographies have changed their laws, including Massachusetts. Success, there's so many factors that go into this. It's really hard to definitively say whether it's enhancing or having any impact on innovation and startup activity. That's my take, at least.
Great.
It's a
And
good
we
question.
have one other question here
Right.
from an anonymous Go Buffs individual. Have you accounted for the superiority of Stanford over MIT in your analysis of the Valley versus Boston comparison?
Yeah. So just to be clear, I would love it if this was my analysis so far. This was the work of Anno Saxenian, who recently retired as Dean of the Information School at Berkeley. I think that, superiority of Stanford versus MIT is something that's obviously highly contentious. But what she did do is she looked at research dollars that were being brought in within the universities in the Boston area versus those that were being brought in the Silicon Valley area. And they were comparable. It really didn't seem to explain it. And if anything, there were other factors like tax rates and real estate that probably would have been thought to frustrate startup activity more in Silicon Valley than Boston. And so I found her analysis in terms of the importance of understanding social norms, industry structure, and the way companies are organized has a powerful effect on outcomes over time. And note, it's not to say, and Saxenian doesn't say this, it's not to say that information sharing across companies and a horizontal approach is always better. It's just at that particular point in time of rapid change, very unstable markets, and really at that time, globalization and standardization, it allowed those companies that were taking a horizontal approach to be comparatively advantaged to what started to look like the dinosaurs in Boston. It's a great question.
Excellent. Okay, we're done with these questions.
Awesome. All right, please drop some more questions in as we head into part 2 here. Hopefully be info sharing. Let me go back to this. All right, back to the share screen. Georgette, are we up and running?
Yes.
All right, let's rock and roll here. All right, so part 2, for-profit accelerators, and the question, the puzzle of why do mentors give away their time and help for free? All right, around 2005 and 2006, there was a birth of a new industry, and that is the industry called an accelerator. The first accelerator was called Y Combinator, actually started out in Boston for a year by Paul Graham. He then moved Y Combinator from Boston out to the Valley, where it continues to this day. And a year later, David Cohen, David Brown, Brad Feld, and Jared Polis started their own accelerator here in Boulder called Techstars. An accelerator, for those that are not familiar with it, is more or less a startup launchpad factory. The idea is to bring in 10 brand new companies all at the same time and to give them 3 different things that they need. 1, space and a chance to work together. In that respect, the accelerator looked like what's often called an incubator. That is a co-location place where startups get together and work. Second input they gave them is money. They acted in many respects like a venture capitalist in saying to startups, we will give you Today, it's about $50,000 in exchange for a percentage of your company. Originally, it was 5%. It's now about 7% of the company. So the exchange is, we will help you start up. Come on into Techstars. We'll give you $50,000. You give us 7% of your company. In that respect, an accelerator looks a lot like a venture capitalist. Okay. Third element is expertise. So in addition to space, in addition to capital, accelerators offer the entrepreneurs and startups that get involved with them an enormous amount of expertise in the form of what is called mentorship. And this starts to look like an MBA light or an educational aspect led by people who have been through the startup process before, who have seen this movie and offer their advice and help to entrepreneurs. Collectively, this is called a private accelerator. Y Combinator to this day remains one of the world's leading accelerators, and Techstars, fast forward since 2006 when it was launched, has become a global phenomenon. It is not an overstatement to say that Techstars is more or less the McKinsey of the startup and innovation world today. Boulder has played an outsized role in the launch of this new industry of accelerators. In addition to Techstars, the world's leading accelerator industry group, the Global Accelerator Network, was out of Boulder. One of the world's first social accelerators, the Unreasonable Institute, was here. And among others that are here, I've got some different ones, like Canopy is an accelerator focused on the cannabis industry. And bottom left is the symbol for Catalyst, Catalyze CU, which is our accelerator program on campus. Again, accelerators, startup launch pads, bring in 10 companies, give them all you can eat help for about 3 months, and then release them into the world. Okay, that's the essence of what an accelerator does. I thought this was interesting and started to examine accelerators, especially this piece around mentorship and expertise. And Techstars, from an early point, said, yes, we give you space. Yes, we give you some money, but the most valuable part of our program is mentorship. We are a mentor-driven accelerator, and that model has persisted until this day. Now, think about ways that if you are Techstars, that you could bring experts into your accelerator who will work with these new entrepreneurs who are trying to launch their startups. Okay. Option number one, you could build it. That is, you could hire full-time experts in-house. Coincidentally, I just took a walk across campus. Beautiful day in Boulder, by the way, here with one of the founders of Techstars. David Brown and I were walking this afternoon, and I asked him, I said, David, did you ever think about just like hiring 5 entrepreneurs in-house to help? And he was like, no, we didn't have the money to do that. The second option is buy. That is, you could contract for this expertise. And David said something kind of interesting. He said, we did, though, think about giving a piece of ownership in our companies to mentors as compensation for them working with our companies. And he said, we ultimately decided not to do that for a variety of reasons, but that was something they did consider. The third option, and what I found when I studied accelerators, is they look for volunteers. They look for the best and brightest venture capitalists. They look for the best and brightest serial entrepreneurs, best and brightest lawyers to volunteer their time for startups. And that is how they organized a network of about 75 mentors who volunteer their time for 3.5 months with the 10 startups that are coming through their accelerators. Okay. And that led me to write 2 articles. The first article is, if there's no contracts involved, that is, no contract between the accelerator and the mentor, no privity between the startup and the mentor, do we see bad behavior? That is, do we see opportunism involved? And the answer by and large was no. And my Stanford Journal article in 2016 provides my analysis as to why are contracts not required to provide this kind of protection. Second is a question of motivation. And that is, bottom line, why do highly qualified individuals give away free help to a for-profit company that is a startup that is nested within a small venture capital fund that is an investment accelerator? And that's the question I puzzled on. And when you look at mentor activity, one way to think about this is it looks a lot like peer production. Here I've got pictures of Linux and Wikipedia and the Mars rover project, where lots of people contributed parts of the production of these things. Think putting together the world's largest encyclopedia. There's a critical mass of participants who contribute information-based contributions to the project. Okay. And number two, crucial contributions are at some level voluntary. But ask yourself, how is mentorship in an accelerator strikingly different than Linux open source project, Wikipedia, or picking up a massive science project like mapping Mars? And the answer is this: peer production typically occurs in open environments where the project is not for profit. And this puzzle around mentors really struck me as, wow, this is fascinating, because it is essentially for-profit peer production. And so why do these highly qualified individuals, a pool of 75 mentors, give away all this help to startups? And so I interviewed about 60 mentors over the course of a couple of years, and here is what I found as an answer. They reported out 6 or 7 different motivations that you could track. So one is intrinsic. They loved working with entrepreneurs because of the energy, the rush that they felt of getting to work with these new entrepreneurs and new startups. And in fact, many thought that had they entered into a contract, it would have diminished that intrinsic motivation to get involved. Second was a feeling of volunteerism, that it gave them a sense of belief. It fueled and enlivened them. Third is many mentors highlighted the benefits that they get of being around an accelerator program with 10 new companies with new ideas. They said it helped them stay fresh. One mentor told me it helped keep my scanning capabilities high and helped refuel me. I got my mojo back working with these companies. They also talked about other types of benefits. That is, that being around this system and working with companies provided opportunities, that is, leads that professionally enhanced their careers. It provided investment opportunities, advisor relationships down the road, and some ultimately got recruited for C-level roles, that is, like CEO, CFO, CTO of companies. One entrepreneur said it felt like we were dating, that is, their relationship as a mentor with a company. Networking benefits. Being one of 75 mentors allows you to meet many of the other mentors in the community. And one individual told me, quote, "I don't know how much it would have cost to organize this myself." And finally, many highlighted how beneficial it was to their reputations to be part of the mentor network. They'd put it immediately up on their LinkedIn profiles, added to their resumes in a sense of, oh, she knows something because she is a mentor for this accelerator. Okay. The larger answer is an insight about how keeping things on a volunteer basis allowed accelerators to create a system of resource exchange called a generalized exchange system, rather than what would have naturally occurred if contracts had been entered into, which would have been, I think, a version of direct exchange. Okay, so direct exchange, what we usually think about in a contractual relationship. You see here this on the left, where it's party one offers something to party two. Say a mentor could offer their advice and expertise to party two, and party two enters into a direct contract back to party one and offers some sort of compensation, say $100 an hour, or more likely for a startup, it would have been a piece of ownership in the company. Not the way that generalized exchange systems work. In generalized exchange, there is a unilateral contribution. That is, mentor, number one, helps startup, number two. It's a unilateral contribution for the most part, okay? And what number one trusts is that this benefit in the generalized exchange system will ultimately circulate back to number one, but it doesn't have to come back from number two in the network, okay? So number one, maybe a mentor that helps a startup, but ultimately by being around that system, number three, maybe another startup, helps the learning of number one because number one's attuned to a new model of starting a company. Social capital and network benefits are enhanced. And it's this circulation that occurs that's very interesting. This has been formalized in the startup community under the term give first. And give first means this. Number one, by contributing to the system, is not involved in altruism. But by giving into the system first, it's trusting that this benefit will circulate back in some form. You don't know when, you don't know in what form, you don't know from whom it's going to come back, but you trust that by being part of this network, the benefit will circulate back to you. And in many respects, as I studied accelerators and why mentors are involved, the powerful benefits associated with generalized exchange drastically outweighed the benefits that would have occurred in a direct exchange network. And that, to me, is the best explanation for why contracts are not used and solves this puzzle as to why mentors give away help for free. It turns out free here is not altruism. There are a ton of benefits that come to mentors who are involved in a system like this. So the linchpin of an investment accelerator's efficacy and really long-term viability of something like Techstars is to architect systems where the contributors, like the mentors, operate under a veil of altruism. They think it feels like volunteerism, but they indirectly benefit in material ways from others in the group and third parties outside the group. So let me stop there, and I will stop the screen sharing and jump into questions. There are some implications we can come back to, but that is my study of the puzzle of why we don't see contracts here. I think there's some really interesting aspects as to what that means for lawyers and what we do at law school in helping people who architect the exchange of resources between parties to think about what kind of exchange are we trying to create here? Should it be a direct exchange system? Should it be a generalized exchange system? And then what tools and devices are appropriate? Are contracts going to be the best way to do it? If so, how do you mix contracts with other devices, including social norms, and awareness of industry structure, et cetera?
It's very interesting, and I think it'll spark some questions here, Brad. We currently they're probably typing away, but currently not a question in there. Let's see.
All right, Jackson Hawk, you are coming from outside the world of law. You're around startups. Fire off a question for us. Preston, great to see you here. Richard Johnson, you've been around this. Fire off a question. Drop them in there, guys.
Okay, we got our first question. I think that direct ask helped. Grant Hellspeller has another question. Has there been any litigation surrounding the issue of mentorship? Has the lack of privity of contract become a legal issue for any of these accelerators?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is, in my 60 plus interviews, I found one egregious example of bad actor in which a mentor who helped a startup later came back and tried to claim that he was an inventor on a patent that the startup had. And in many respects, this is the exception that proves the rule. Because what happened to that mentor is the individual was summarily ostracized from the startup community. And so reputation markets here serve to say that this mentor was acting in bad faith, that individual knew they were supposed to be contributing to the startup, not trying to claim a piece of ownership of that startup's intellectual property. People refused to do business with that individual. And it really was a case of social ostracism. And so there wasn't litigation over what to do with the mentor. The mentor, was able to make a claim with respect to the patent as an inventor, but the downstream business consequences for that individual were so severe that it explains why, in the absence of a legal agreement, there are powerful social norms that operate to constrain behavior and, in fact, punish bad behavior.
Well, we do have another question. I do want to also mention Jackson Hawk said he was driving, so he's not able to ask, but we have two other questions here. The first from Mark Hansen. Are there contracts between the accelerator and the mentors?
No, is the short answer. And that's one of the puzzles here, because the accelerators that I studied are private for-profit entities. And in fact, one way to think about them is as small venture capital funds, or at least in terms of the small amounts of investments that they make in a lot of companies that they work with. And you could imagine mentors coming and saying, come on, man, you're making money. What's in it for me? And so that's one of the interesting things as to how this ended up getting constructed and has worked so far is, by and large, no, there's no privity between the mentor and the accelerator, nor is there privity between the mentor and the startup.
Okay, good to know. Richard Johnson has our next question. Are these studies focused on mentors around
combinators? He means
combinators, specifically, or in the startup world more generally?
Yeah, so these studies that I did are focused around investment accelerators. So a certain type of accelerator that is for profit and makes investments in the companies. I do work frequently with mentors in different contexts, especially around entrepreneurship at CU. And you do see a lot of the same kinds of benefits in terms of a system of generalized exchange. I'll also make this specific to some of the behavior. I'll just leave it at that. So in my experience, a lot of what I've seen in terms of mentorship in accelerators is replicated in terms of other parts of the startup community. I will say that I think mentors get more profound benefits out of the accelerator for a couple different reasons. One is exclusive accelerators. The reputational benefits of being a mentor there are stronger than, say, being a mentor into something that's not very exclusive or difficult to get into. So that's one way it looks different. And second, when you've got an accelerator that brings people together, that allows for certain benefits like social capital and networking to be enhanced in those settings too. So I think it sort of takes things that occur anyway, but amplifies them within the accelerator context.
Thank you. We have some time for one more question. If anybody has a question out there. Just like that. Andy Marchant, in your discussions with mentors, have they ever identified what, if any, legal contractual terms they might actually like to see put in writing?
Yeah. Well, let me back up a little bit and say one of the interesting things is many mentors would not participate if there was a contract between themselves and accelerators and themselves and startups. Some for reasons that might be intuitive. That is, I want to do this for intrinsic reasons. I don't want to turn it into a transaction. but some of the reasons were kind of surprising. For example, several venture capitalists reported that they have clauses with their limited partners as part of what's called the limited partnership agreement of their fund, that they essentially contract with their bosses that they won't moonlight with side jobs. And that if they were to receive contractual benefits, that kind of formalization and direct compensation would have run afoul of their limited partnership agreements. And so in some respects, this turned out to be a way to get high functioning venture capitalists to participate, or at least not deter their participation by avoiding contracts. I had several CEOs say something along these lines, which is it may or may not be a conflict of interest for them to help another company, especially something that might be in an adjacent space, but they just wouldn't feel right taking compensation for that work because it would have felt like moonlighting when their job is to be full-time with the company. And it was interesting because you could think about, well, okay, if putting a contract in place to do the same damn thing would have been a violation of the LPA or a violation of what you feel like is a conflict of interest, you're functionally doing the same thing for the startups. Why does it matter? But for them, it made a big difference. It made a big difference. And they said they wouldn't have participated. And conversely, accelerators told me mentors who wanted direct compensation tended to be in it for the wrong reasons from their perspective. And it tended to be individuals that were not quite as accomplished or high functioning. And so very interestingly, this became a way for them to find, quote, the right kinds of mentors for their program.
Okay, well, we have two more questions. I think we can squeeze in two if Brad, you're up for it.
Yeah.
This is from our friend Go Buffs. How do you avoid clear conflicts of interest when mentors are moonlighting?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think the informality of the mentor startup relationship means that people are by and large just using their judgment. I'm not aware of any formal cases that have been brought against a mentor saying that you violated a conflict of interest or agreement somewhere else. So I think by and large people are using their judgment, and I think there is something that to the fact that without contracts, there just doesn't seem to be a trigger for the normal things that often signal a conflict of interest for other parties, especially third parties outside of it. So that's probably a good enough answer. And our last question is?
Our last question. I've seen a few articles around the rise of solo VCs, meaning the funds who are run by a single individual. Have you seen any evidence of these solo VCs encroaching onto the territory of mentors?
The answer to that is no. And I think in many respects, it's complementary. So if you are a solo venture capitalist, especially one that's operating with early stage new startups, you might want to be a mentor yourself. I've spoken to some solo VCs who said they typically got into an accelerator as a mentor to enhance their reputation, and because they might see deals, that is, they get to work with companies for 3 months and decide who they want to invest in. The solo VCs I talked to said, actually, that didn't turn out to be the big benefit that I got from being a mentor. So the benefit that I got was I helped a couple entrepreneurs who I had great relationships with, and they have friends who have the hottest startups. And when their friend with a hot startup was looking to raise money, they introduced the friend to me, and that's where I found my best deal flow. And so that's a great example of an indirect exchange that happens through a generalized exchange system where the benefit came back to that mentor, not from the startups that he directly helped, but by being part of that network, he was able to get referrals to the best deals for him, the most lucrative deals. Kind of an interesting example.
Wow. Well, that was our last question. I thank you so much, Brad, for the informative presentation. and dynamic discussion. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. I imagine you'll get some more questions via email. I want to thank everyone for joining us and for engaging in this meaningful conversation. Next week, you'll receive a link to the recording of the presentation and a survey to share your thoughts with us. Colorado attorneys will receive a link for the CLE affidavit. I wish each of you an excellent rest of your evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Georgette. Be well, everybody.